We'll hear now from three panelists: Simon Zadek, Chair of the Finance for Biodiversity Program, Sven Giegold, Member of the European Parliament for the Greens, and then Josh Ryan Collins, who's Head of Finance and Macroeconomics at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. Yeah, let's move right on to this discussion. For all the participants, we see your questions coming. We'll address them after the presentations from the speakers and try to have the session as interactive as possible. We're also responding to them on Twitter, so please bear with us. Simon, if you want to share a few thoughts with us.
Thanks, Benoit, and thanks to you and Sandrine for making this event happen. I think it's very timely, and the comments I've heard so far both eat into some of the things that I was going to talk about, so I can miss those out and save time, and I can focus down on areas where I think a little bit of value can be added. There were just sort of 4 points from what I've heard that I want to amplify very briefly first, and then I'll jump onto the substance of what I was planning to say. But first is, particularly thinking about Marcus's presentation, I think what he meant to say was that this was the EU-wide strategy, not the EU strategy, because we're missing what 27 different countries are actually planning on doing. And I do think we need to focus down a little bit on both what happens at a Brussels-wide level, which is obviously impressive and hugely important, but actually what happens at a sovereign level, which encompasses, collectively, the single largest economy and source of wealth on the planet today. So I'm sort of missing that piece, and I'll come back to that in one of the proposals that I want to make. Secondly, I think we need to focus not only on what happens in the EU, but what happens by the EU. And I think that reflects a broader internationalist agenda that has been alluded to a couple of times by the last two presenters. It felt to me that the sort of EU frame that we heard earlier on in the event was rather inward looking, if I could say, and really didn't relate to the hugely important footprint that the continent has through policy and investment and trade and indeed standards development in various different ways. It seemed to me that Sandrine's quite correct call out of the GDP story, of course, desperately old and sad and tired in many ways, and yet maybe this is a moment in time where it has a new resonance. Why would we have an ambitious Commission New Green Deal play linked to a recovery program and an almost endless amount of money without resetting the overarching metric at this point? Kind of what point have we missed in that? And then finally, just on some of the kind of recaps or draw-ins from things that people have said, particularly my last two colleagues, have made the point of the link between climate and biodiversity. And I can only tell you that through an investor lens, this is an incomprehensible linkage. We may sit here as scientists knowing all about biodiversity and climate and point out all of the important interconnections. We may sit in international intergovernmental processes, and recognize the importance of the linkages between the content of CBD and COP, but actually through an investor lens, these linkages are completely obscure. And actually most investors are saying, please leave us alone. You've persuaded us by beating us over the head that we should look at climate, and now you're giving us some other huge agenda that we find completely incomprehensible and out of touch with what we're actually capable of doing. So there's real work to do in showing what that linkage is through an investor lens, not only through a science-based or intergovernmental lens. Let me then sort of just jump on quite quickly to the areas I wanted to highlight. It would be foolish of me not to repeat what people have said, which is the nexus between the new Green Deal and digital. So that's the large-scale, long-term EU game plan, and the plug back to the green recovery is absolutely critical. And I know it's been said and needs to be said many times over, but it is unique in the world today. And so this is a remarkable policy frame that we have if we can figure out what to do. But the other piece that's kind of unusual at this moment, yeah, is that for a green community starved of money, we have a moment in time where there's no shortage. Yeah, and that sort of challenges us to step back and ask the question, do we really understand how money works and how it can be more effectively deployed? And I wanted really to turn to that in 3 out of the 4 specific proposals I wanted to make, all of which kind of emanate around the work that the Initiative Finance for Biodiversity is involved in, but with many, many other actors. So the first, already alluded to, yeah, is that we have come out of a period of fiscal austerity and we have a seemingly unlimited public budget. And the numbers are, as you know, in the many trillions when you look at it globally, and in the trillions when you look at it at a continental level. Conditionality is key. I'm not the first and I won't be the last to say it, but we heard today from Marcus that it won't be applied, that it won't be applied at the solvency level. And so we do face a challenge that multiple industries are in the process of being bailed out. Yeah, plastics being an obvious case in point, with the collapse in the price of oil, the falling price of virgin resin, it leads to a dramatic increase in the use of single-use plastics and other plastics, and we all know that this is one of our grand catastrophes in motion. And actually, that is replicated across multiple areas where solvency crises by particular companies and sectors are leading to calls on public finance, so our money, just to remind us all, without really serious conditionality being applied. So, been said before, but we need to make it clearer and stronger that actually there isn't a free pass just because a few companies or sectors are highly distressed today. We need to take this next series of months where that solvency instrument will be applied much more seriously and much more robustly. So that would be a sort of first plea for focus over the coming months, and rejection for a sort of a yes, we'll get to green in a minute once we've bailed out these various companies and sectors. I think the second, and oddly enough, not really alluded to very much in the conversation so far, is that there are 2 stimuluses going on, or 2 stimuli, in fact, not one. The one that we all see peaking above the water is obviously fiscal. The one we don't see, or at least is not so visible to most, is what the European Central Bank is doing. Now, the European Central Bank obviously had a critical role to play in the great financial crisis, as did many other central banks, because we had a different view about fiscal solutions to that crisis, i.e., there were deemed to be none. So fiscal, we have the option here, but we still see these huge huge bond buying programs as money is being pumped into the economy through the back end, through what central bank operations are doing across the world, but notably in Europe, the ECB. Last time round, we tried to push a sort of green bond view as to how that bond buying program should work, and we failed completely. And we failed completely for a number of reasons, but most importantly, because it was argued they could only buy sovereign debt, they could only buy high investment grade, and that there were rules of the game that required a balanced purchase program across EU countries. So there was in fact, across Euro countries, to be slightly more specific. Actually, the ECB has now broken all those rules. That there isn't a balanced program according to the weight of debt across Euro countries, that there is a growing amount of asset-backed securities being purchased, so not sovereign debt, and that there is a growing amount of debt being purchased by the ECB that hasn't quite reached junk status, but is approximating it. And so actually, the reasons that were given 10 years ago why a green play wasn't possible by the ECB are now all effectively by and by. And we need to understand that that stimulus program is as important as the one that we see coming through the front door, which is the fiscal part of the story. So a lot to do there. That brings me then to my third piece. So for those of you, who are in the finance space, you will be watching with fear the emerging market sovereign debt crisis. Yeah, it has multiple implications that I won't kind of go into extensively now, but suffice to say that it is a coming to roost of a period where financial return seeking financial institutions from Europe, North America, and elsewhere have been pushing debt at emerging markets because the rate of return was higher following the financial crisis and the extremely low rates of return in more developed countries. That partly linked to that, obviously then in the context of the crisis, is a rapidly increasing fiscal crisis due to increased spending related to stimulus and reduced tax revenues, which is leading to a sovereign debt crisis that will go well beyond anything that we saw in the great financial crisis in 2009-10. This is an extraordinary opportunity. It is an opportunity for introducing biodiversity into the sovereign debt markets. It is a moment in time where, as those debt restructuring negotiations begin to happen, we can propose very practically a new generation of biodiversity performance-related bonds to replace some of the vanilla sovereign debt, which is currently too expensive to service and unserviceable given the state of many emerging markets. This is not simply a conditionality in a green costume. This is an opportunity to reduce the cost of capital during debt restructuring to emerging markets, that are incurring a crisis that is not of their own making, whilst at the same time making CBD and COP real by bringing performance-based debt into the sovereign debt market and beginning to make that natural capital accounting that everybody's been talking about for so long real in $100 trillion worth of debt market going forward. This is an amazing opportunity, and we have about 5 minutes to figure it out. That if we wake up tomorrow, it will be too late. Finance for Biodiversity is pushing forward a big piece of work in this area. And on the ownership of the debt side, the EU is absolutely critical. So when we're looking at official ownership of sovereign debt of emerging markets, we basically have the Paris Club, let's call it the West, for want of a better word, plus China. China's holding of official sovereign debt of emerging markets has gone through the roof in the last 10 years, and we need to get them to engage on the debt restructuring side with that CBD leadership hat in mind. But to do that, that requires that the EU likewise comes to the table, and the obvious opportunity for that is the EU presidency China interconnect that will happen in the context of a sort of virtual Leipzig moment. And that can be brought to the table very effectively at this stage. Fourthly, sorry, Benoit, I'll just be a couple of minutes and I'm done. Fourthly, I wanted to come back to the point that a number of people have made, which is to do with measurement and accountability. Green stimulus needs to be measured. It needs to be measured not after the event when we all can use metrics to complain that it didn't turn out the way we wanted it, but in real time. We are in a digital world, and we can measure green stimulus from the moment that it's talked about to the moment that the last bag of cement is used to build that bridge that it shouldn't have financed. The Finance for Biodiversity has built a green stimulus index that covers every single EU country. And that can be repurposed into a more sophisticated approach to run real-time assessments as to how green stimulus, both the one above the water, fiscal, and the one under the water, ECB purchase programs, and the way in which countries function in that context are run. So I think we have the opportunity of a new generation of oversight, that works across the EU, that is framed by EU policy, but that functions at each individual country level, where stimulus programs will actually play out in practice. So Benoit, hopefully that doesn't repeat too much of what has been said, and I look forward to any thoughts or comments on my proposals.
No, thanks a lot, Simon, for some very specific points, some of them quite provocative, ambitious, I would say. We won't be able to respond to all of them, but certainly extremely helpful. Thanks a lot, Sven, for having joined us from the beginning, for having been patient. And it's now to you to share some of your thoughts on these topics. So we'll hear from you. We'll also briefly hear from Joshua and Collins, and then I'd like to have a discussion. And every panelist would be welcome to join and have a bit more interaction on the panel, but we still have a good half hour on this panel, so that's good news. Sven, please.
So thank you for organizing this conference. I hope you can hear me well, and it's coming really at the right moment. I would like to stick to the original title, so how to put the environmental limits of the planet and the necessary transformation of our economies at the heart of the current debates about recovery. Obviously, I will be a bit more to the political issues which are at the moment debated in the framework of the proposal by the Commission, and then perhaps this is a good contrast to the former speaker. So obviously, first one has to honor what is happening at the moment in Europe. It's not long ago that everybody was talking about renationalization and no ability to act. And we know the story of Europe. Usually Europe grows stronger out of a crisis. And it looks the same. Who of us would have dared to claim that Merkel and Macron would together propose a 500 billion package of basically subsidies to the different member states, so not based on loans, but financed with loans, and then targeted to the digital and green transformation. That was the promise. So it was totally out of scope. I would say nobody beyond academic circles was proposing something like that. And now, because of the Corona crisis and the danger to the European project, we are right there. So that was the big promise. The Parliament responded and said, yes, this is what we want. The Commission said, we will look at it, and they made a proposal. So I fear politically now that we have the following situation. On the one hand, one has to look at the fine print, whether the promise to gear the MFF, the public spending, including the recovery package, to the green transformation and to the digital transformation, whether that promise is actually kept. And second, there is of course another obvious danger, that as this is quite ambitious from a European policy perspective, that everything else which is needed for the Green Deal will be much weaker. Simply, for instance, from a German perspective, for the Christian Democrats, this proposal is really the opposite of what they have been promising on European integration for the last 20 years. Common debt issuance, common taxation, lots of new public funding from the European level to the weaker countries, the famous transfer union. So they had to swallow a lot. So therefore, politically, the danger is that the counter reaction to come is then we cannot afford all the green regulation which is coming. But I think it's key when we discuss finance in the green transformation, to always keep in mind that investment is a needed tool to get the transformation, but investment by itself, so through the right channels of finance and so on, we will not achieve the necessary transformation. For this, it needs the right price incentives and the right regulatory environment. And on that level, I'm much less confident at the moment that the Commission is equally strong and the member states in particular are equally strong. So probably the biggest boost for climate finance is not fiddling with sustainable finance. It is a binding -55, -65 CO2 target. The biggest guarantee in order to have larger investment in biodiversity in Europe is to have binding rules, how we do agriculture, how we have to take care of our Nature 2000 areas. So if we take our own laws seriously and reinforce them, we will force also the investment much more effectively than getting banks and investment funds and insurances to do accounting for the environmental footprint of their investment. And this is easily forgotten in investment circles. So I think the first thing if we want to have higher green investment, is not so much talking about taxonomy, sustainable finance, all this is important, but much more is important that we have binding rules on prices and on regulation for the different sectors. And this includes, of course, climate as well as biodiversity. So therefore, this is critical. Then, when we say we have a double emergency, climate and the corona situation and the danger of splits in the European integration process, then the most clever demands are not those which are breaking with fundamental path. What do I mean with this? If we want to have a price mechanism, then we have a better chance to achieve in the ETS framework under majority voting, rather than to propose now to calculate in a totally new way corporate income taxation, as it is proposed now by lots of people from the NGO and academic and political world, and to say we should now invent a system how to calculate corporate income taxation according to a CO2 footprint. There's no methodology. It's a total break with the way how we do business so far. Equally, if we have the independence of the ECB, the policy proposals which say, let's first enter into changing the EU treaty in order to end the ECB independence, so that we can force them to invest to a certain degree into a European climate bank. Sorry, folks, these are great ideas, but they are not going to happen quickly. So there's a contradiction of saying we are in an emergency and to propose things of which we know that they are politically extremely cumbersome. So therefore, the key question is how to be radical in the framework of the path we have set now. I know this is extremely controversial in an NGO community, but I think it is fair to think about this. And I see a lot of proposals which simply say how we are in an emergency, so we have to propose the most radical break with our legal system which have been anchored in the EU treaty, of which we all know it takes at least another 5 years to change them. And this is not corresponding to what we need in order to be truly radical, which means in climate terms, in biodiversity terms, to act now. So what we therefore, I think, need is, in the framework of the current recovery plan, that it's not good enough to anchor the do no harm principle for the recovery part. It has to be also in the original MFF part. Otherwise, there's well a possibility that we will see new airports, new motorways, and all the rest of it. That is what we don't want to. The do no harm is not good enough together with a 25% climate target. It's not good enough because we need to invest much more into the future sectors, and if the rest of the 25% is only monitored by a do no harm principle, this is simply not good enough. It needs a higher share and a tougher interpretation of what is not to be financed. Then it is welcome that the joint transition, the Just Transition Fund is now increased. The former version was pure symbolism. Now it's a bit more serious. This is important because I agree with the colleague of the Club of Rome. Any transformation strategy which is not seen socially just will never fly. Therefore, it is good that this is increased, but when we come to discussing the pricing mechanisms, such as an ETS reform or border tax, carbon border adjustment and the like, the revenue coming from new environmental taxes cannot be simply put into investment. They have to be, at least to a significant part, redistributed to the citizens so that those who pay by a larger share of their income in terms of CO2 taxation, that they have after the environmental tax reform, that they actually have more money in their pockets than before. Otherwise, the poor will have to adapt to the climate crisis while the rich can simply afford to continue their lifestyle. This is not going to work, therefore there leads to a stronger social impact. I would lastly finalize with one point and with one recommendation. So first, the Commission has proposed to link the spending from the recovery plan with the European semester. Look, so far the European semester was a paper tiger. Nobody was much interested in it. If the semester for the coordination of the member states' policies gets more binding, this is a priori a good story. But then these recommendations may not follow a narrow, old-style vision of how to reform economies. So the green and the social side has to be anchored much more strongly. But most importantly, so far, this is recommendations driven by experts in the Commission and voted by the Council. The Parliament is out, but if budget spending is geared by the semester, then the semester needs a democratic reform. Otherwise, the semester is simply an infringement into the budgetary rights of the Parliament. So the recommendations by itself, the package of the semester, has to be voted in the Parliament and not anymore left to a pure experts circle. This would also ensure that green issues are taken seriously. And lastly, what I didn't cover and what's very important, to go through the different sectors in the MFF and recovery proposal. There's a lot to say about the common agricultural policy, the lack of clean chemicals and so on. There was a very interesting overview by the European Environmental Bureau. I won't repeat it. Thank you for listening to me, but please, for the sector analysis, I would say the EIB has done a good job.
Thanks a lot, Sven. There'd be a lot to unpack in what you said. Same for Simon's presentation. So we want to move to a discussion. Yeah, I think you made some clear points. I want to say some of them are echoed in Finance Watch report, that you need political leadership, you need clear targets, you need economic and environmental regulation, and then indeed public spending, and then finally private finance will largely follow. So, but again, let's move to a discussion. We're now going to hear from Josh Ryan Collins from the IIPP. And then please, Sven and Simon, maybe prepare questions to each other, because I'd like to have a more of an interactive discussion. We'll eat 5 minutes at the break if it's okay. So aim at finishing this panel at 11:35. But please, Josh, so yourself and Mariana Mazzucato, you've been pushing for a few years for a shift in paradigm in terms of the role of the state in the economy, moving more to a mission-oriented states and way to do business. And yeah, I guess this might be seen as an opportunity, especially at EU level, to move to this much more ambitious and state-led transformation. Sven, you want to say something before we move to Josh?
I put it in the chat.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. Josh.
Thanks, Benoit. Thanks, everyone, for having me, and congratulations on the Nature's Return report, which I thought was a great effort on a very complex topic. Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words. I'll keep it brief about. I agree with what you just said, that this situation we have here is an enormous opportunity. We've got essentially the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression, which is hitting Europe as much as it is globally. And we have, for the first time, I think, a recognition by the EU that the previous system of financing Eurozone countries was not sustainable. And obviously the 10 years that followed the crisis of 2008 made that very clear. So the question, I guess, is how we take advantage of the twin opportunities that this presents. We at IIPP, as has been mentioned, have been working quite closely with the European Commission on the topic of innovation, and we've been advising the Horizon 2020. There's a €100 billion program going forwards, and we've actually helped them reshape that program so that the funding itself is focused not on particular sectors or particular firms or on picking winners, as the phraseology goes in the sort of mainstream economic circles that are critical of that approach, but much more on financing missions, financing longer term goals with measurable concrete outcomes. And one of those, for example, was cleaner oceans. And that is the approach that I think we need to be taking across these packages we've been discussing today, including the MMF and financing for biodiversity. So it's not just innovation financing that this approach needs to be applied to. It's the whole swathe of tools and policies that the EU has. Most obviously, the European Union's industrial strategy that's been recently relaunched and revamped. But also, as Simon was mentioning, monetary policy, financial regulation, but then at the national level and the regional level and the local level, there are other tools such as public procurement, which involves huge amounts of spending, and environmental and other forms of regulation. And what needs to happen is that all of these tools need to be pushing in the same direction towards a more sustainable Europe, and one which supports biodiversity. I mean, there are many ways we can do this in the short term, in terms of the bailout packages, the finance that are supporting industries that at the moment are struggling. And I think Simon was right that there's a bit of a problem at the moment that we're flooding these industries such as aviation and the fossil fuels sector and some unsustainable other sustainable industries dependent on oil, with debt essentially to prop them up, as if what we're facing is a liquidity crisis similar to the crisis of 2008, where there just wasn't enough bank credit flowing into these sectors. Actually, this is, I think, this is a solvency issue for many of these firms. Their business models, even before COVID, even before the pandemic, were not sustainable in the sort of medium term. In a sense, the COVID crisis has just sped up that process of financial markets and others and governments realizing that they were not sustainable. So it's sort of just fast forwarded the process, which is a good thing from a sustainability perspective. But the danger is that the lack of conditionalities on the bailout packages that we have simply prop these industries up, and they become sort of zombie firms, and sort of even worse than zombie banks, in that the activities they're doing are directly contributing to a sort of carbon lock-in pathway that we know is unsustainable, and in some cases as well they do pose threats to nature, which the report brings out really well. So we need to be applying conditionalities to these firms that go along with these bailouts. I mean, just one example, in the agricultural sector, you know, maybe public support for agricultural firms should be made conditional on reducing pesticide use in line with the targets laid out in the EU's new biodiversity strategy, which, by the way, I thought had a lot to recommend it. There was a lot of strong ideas in there that are world leading to some extent. The question is, you know, to what extent are these ideas actually going to be enforceable? And they won't happen. It won't happen at a nation state level, whatever the European Commission says, unless there are some more binding regulations and rules in place, as Sven was emphasising. The other point, just to make specifically, I guess, on the biodiversity issue and the sort of risks that we face from biodiversity loss, and more generally, you know, what's been called the first economic crisis of the Anthropocene, as Adam Tooze put it, that is this pandemic. What it's made clear, I think, is that the continuing encroachment of human activity onto nature will eventually come back to hit us squarely in the face. But the timing of those shocks, those types of nature-related shocks, such as pandemics, the scale of them, and the dynamics of them are extremely difficult to predict. And really, we're talking about fundamental levels of uncertainty in terms of those economic impacts. So that requires a sort of change of thinking, a change of paradigm in terms of our ability to sort of forecast financial risks and economic risks arising out of these problems. We're not in a world where you can assign different probabilities, you know, in the classic sort of financial modeling to sort of 3-5 years in the future. We're in a world where we really don't know what might be happening, but we do know that the level of risk is definitely higher. And that calls for a more precautionary approach, I think, generally from financial policymakers and from fiscal policymakers to conserve nature, to ensure we have a system of natural capital accounting in place. And as I said, to utilize all of those tools of industrial policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, all honed around the mission that we're following on, we're pursuing, basically. So, you know, to summarize, and the final point I would just make really is, I think to achieve that, we also need to leverage existing EU institutions more effectively. In particular, I would say we need to be thinking about the role of state investment banks and other public financial institutions. These institutions have played a strong role in the EU. The KfW, for example, in Germany, has been a hugely important player in supporting the green transition in Germany, whether it's investment in R&D or just helping people get solar panels on their roofs, working with the banking system in that country. We need similar institutions in other EU countries, maybe in some of the poorer EU Eurozone states, to give them a greater degree of financial autonomy, given the fiscal constraints, which I think, although Simon mentions that some of those constraints appear to have been thrown off, the danger is they will return once things return to normality. But if you imagine Spain or Greece or Poland or some of the other more fiscally constrained countries having a major state investment bank like the KfW, that frees up their ability to pursue these missions and to crowd in private finance. I think we need to be worrying less about crowding out and more about crowding in, de-risking those areas, and particularly in this area of net biodiversity and nature preservation. It's key that the public sector plays a leading market shaping role to de-risk for the private sector. And the final point I would just make is around this just transition concept. That's absolutely key. You know, I don't know if we've already been discussing the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, but core to that was actually creating tens of thousands of jobs involved in nature preservation, whether it's parks, whether it's other forms of biodiversity preservation. That was core. There are a lot of jobs to be created. That didn't come strongly out of the biodiversity strategy. The biodiversity strategy, for me, that creating jobs and preserving nature can be this part of the same package. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Sven, I know you have to run to a meeting with the Commission, so if you want to say a few more words before you go. You're on mute.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think it's more polite simply to say bye-bye and all the best. I wish you well. And it makes a real discussion not possible anymore. I wish you well and all the best. Looking forward to see the results of the conference.
For sure.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Sven. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks, Josh, for being quite specific and provocative as well and concise. Simon, do you want to react at this point? Luc, I know you also have to leave, so if you want to throw in a question.
So I'm sort of watching. I'll just a note, Luke, and then you jump in.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sort of looking at these side notes that are coming up, particularly between the panelists, that not everybody can see, and it's like it's a sort of bipolar set of texts. You've got one bunch of people going, yeah, but why don't we do something and let's get back to the core concept, and you've got another bunch of people going, here are some big numbers that we can influence, and it's super interesting to read these texts. That even in this conversation, yeah, there's a kind of disconnect between the guardians of biodiversity who know a lot about finance and economics, and the folks coming through the sort of finance economics side trying to make the connect across. And so I think what we've heard in the last hour, yeah, is a set of practical ways to shape how hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars, our biodiversity, I'll keep it really loose, influenced over the coming 3 or 4 years. I really do think we've heard the list, and that we should understand that we're not looking for the answer, we're trying to make that list happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's not news in a way, but I think the news story in town, notwithstanding Josh's point that eventually someone's going to have to pay the fiscal bill, yeah, is that we do have these large scale flows, domestically, central banking, debt markets, and so on, and we do have some policy influence over them, and we should really knuckle down to that.
No, and we should reconvene to join forces and make sure this happens, as you said. Luke, before you go, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I just wanted to react also to what Simon said. It is indeed interesting that, I mean, I don't think it's bipolar, it's not that bad, but the connectivities are still to be made and have to be made much stronger. And on a personal note, I come from the climate change world, if you like, focusing on the clean revolution and the low carbon technology and mostly on the technological fix, which is part of the solution and very important. And there we were able to create an enthusiasm about these solutions and bottom-up approaches, and businesses saw their opportunity. There's a whole kind of positive bend to it, and we're struggling to do the same when it comes to nature and biodiversity, obviously because it is much more intertwined even than just the economic system, in which we see the energy connection and the kind of return on investment is much clearer. So we are struggling with trying to find the same enthusiasm both on action and on finance. We all know it's still not enough on the climate part as well, but still we see a good traction resulting ultimately in the Paris Agreement. To find a Paris Agreement for biodiversity, we will have to start to go out of our comfort zone. And I think especially in the finance sector, there's always discussion about risk. And especially with this pandemic, I mean, we are looking at the risks still in a very, very conservative way. And I think the risks we have to start looking differently at risks, and that might start to change how investors are thinking and starting to do their business. So I think there's a bit more a fundamental change that might be needed. And then, yes, what is uncomfortable is in the conservation community, when you talk about natural capital and the accounting for natural capital, you have a whole debate about monetizing nature, marketing nature. So there is that tension as well. But then the one, I'll end with a quote from a Scottish high-level, or I think it was a deputy minister, and at some point he said, it's worse not to give any value to nature than to give some value through a natural capital accounting system. But we have to be careful when we use it, and ICN will be there to be some sort of a watchdog that it doesn't derail into commodifying nature. But we need some change, and we need to, until the language and the GDP language and the whole system, financial system and the whole economic system is changed, we can't wait for that. So we now need at least to start to talk some language that the classical investment community better understands.
Thanks a lot, Luc. And I think to reflect on what you said and also what Simon and Josh said, and sort of the uncomfort, or is it bipolar or not, we don't know. But so addressing this change, I think we're also talking about the elite to some extent. I mean, also going back to the idea of a just transition and in fact, the popular demand for these massive changes. We say, oh, well, you can't talk about the ECB doing green, you know, that's in the treaty. I mean, there's a strong contrast with what people are increasingly demanding and also, you know, willing to change in their own lives. Going back to what Sandrine said in the opening of this conference, I think it's striking how people have been, I don't want to say docile, but how people have adapted brutally over a few weeks to being locked down, basically in their homes, where a few weeks before you would say, oh no, but you can't ask people to use their cars less. Well, yeah, they've been locked down now, so no cars, no planes, no anything. And so it shows to some extent that I think at the population level, at citizens level, of course, at Finance Watch, we have two legs. We have one inside the tent and the policy and the complexity and pushing for ambitious reforms. We have one leg with society and unions and consumers. And on that side, you see that there's much more readiness. And how do we capture and tap into that popular support, popular demand for big change and link it to the current elite discussion, which maybe is a bit still bipolar. I might agree with.
I have one sentence to add. Maybe is the point about the question now with this crisis. Also, when the question pops, who's going to pay for it? I think that's the completely wrong question, because we all know that there is enough money out there to solve everything that we need to solve. I mean, the finance is there. It is. We have to also. I see that this is very much a redistribution discussion.
Yeah.
It's a redistribution discussion. It is. We don't want to hear the word tax, but it has a lot to do with taxes and to change the tax, not only taxonomy, but the tax system properly.
And who you tax.
And honestly get the money where it is and use it wisely for health, for people, for nature, and for climate. There is money enough. I think that is something sounds a bit shortcut, but it's actually the truth.
Thank you, Luc. Sandrine.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, because I fully agree with Simon. I've also been observing this kind of disconnect between those that are trying to find the solutions and those that still somehow don't believe that those solutions naturally match what they feel needs to happen. And I think we're all moving in a similar direction, by the way. And as Luc said, there's no way out. We all have to be positive and try to figure this. But I would like to add to the fact that also Simon and others indicated that we've got the capital and what Luc has just said, but we not only have the capital, we've got the perversities in the market that we need to shift. And this is partly Luc's point. So, you know, we need to subsidize differently. We need to allocate taxation differently. And post-COVID, we do have that potential. One thing that hasn't been said here is, let's go back to people and what they're saying post-COVID, because governments are saying we need to bail out. This is the only way we're going to survive economically. But those same governments, like the UK, haven't looked at their own survey results of citizens who are saying very clearly 91% of them we don't want to go back to business as usual. Same with France, similar numbers. So I think Simon wants to come in, but I think we also have to hold governments accountable for a leadership that reflects what people actually want. What do they claim is essential to them? And come back to a sense of sufficiency and true value-based finance rather than continuing to put a value on the wrong things.
Yeah, absolutely. And back to Simon now, but the Green Stimulus Index by Vivid Economics, we've promoted it, is a way to hold governments into account and give transparency to people as to what their governments are doing. Simon.
Yeah, so actually Sandrine's comments were like a sort of framing end, but I'll do an epilogue. And so the epilogue is certainly, this is a big long game, but in the context of the recovery, it's 5 minutes. And I just wanted to reinforce the point because that creates an organizational challenge that we're not very used to, is the truth. You know, that the solvency bailouts, you know, will happen, you know, by tomorrow morning. The, you know, ECB, you know, bond buying will happen by the day after, and the debt restructuring will happen by the end of the weekend. And I don't mean it literally, but I just mean, you know, these are very, very short-term, very large financial flows. And so I agree with Luke that there's a lot of money there, but the time window over which it's moving is remarkably, remarkably short. We've never seen anything like this before. And so that, Benoit and Sandrine, you know, we all have organizational models, we all have the language of urgency, but actually to mobilize in these very short periods of time to influence these financial flows ain't so simple. And I think we should, perhaps we can't in this session, Benoit, but really how one organizes over such a short time period becomes really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Well noted indeed. We need to continue this discussion in a different context to see how we can make that happen in such a short time frame, and we will definitely do that. Josh, you haven't come in the discussion as we're wrapping up this panel to allow for a very short break before we move to the private finance session. Do you wanna come in, or any other panelists as we close the session?
Yeah. It's been a really interesting discussion. I just wanted to raise one point around the role for fiscal policy and for government to actually take a lead here is absolutely key. I mean, for many years in mainstream economics, the view of fiscal policy has been, it's just there to stabilize an economy that occasionally gets knocked out of equilibrium. You lower interest rates, you do a bit of counter-cyclical spending. I think what we're realizing now, particularly post the pandemic, is that actually the role of the state is much greater than just fixing those market errors or correcting the market. We actually need the state to shape the market in the direction, in a more sustainable direction, to create a more resilient economy, actually. And biodiversity and nature is a key element of that. So I hope that the European Union and the European Commission can shift a little bit away from that market fixing approach towards a more market shaping approach to policy.
Thanks a lot. And I think people are demanding that, by the way. I mean, I see again this dichotomy between, you know, some of the elites and the governments, you know, fearing to take blunt action, and then people in the street actually asking for that action. And in fact, you'll find that in the cartoons we're publishing today on how to shift the economy and finance to align it with nature. We actually represent some of this dichotomy between the asks in the streets and again, voters, as I think Sandrine said, and taxpayers, and some of the contradictions within the elite in terms of lack of ambition.